You know what? No. Just trigger warning. One of these stories is just bad. I gagged twice while recording, and I needed to let you know straight away. I've marked it in the timestamps with trigger warning, so please, if you don't want to gag like I did, skip the story. The rest are fine. It's good. Just, this story is just something else, okay? You've been warned. Oh, and if you like to support me, please check out my Patreon page, link in the description. But for now, it's time to get very uncomfortable indeed, and let the darkness take control. Working in death care, you grow a certain tolerance for the quiet, as you spend a lot of time alone around the dead. I work at what is called a combo location, meaning we have a funeral home, cemetery, and crematory all on the same site. And while I've come to accept the strange undercurrents that come with this job, some experiences still leave us rattled. Let me start off with the lighter stuff. I tend to stay late into the evening while one of my co-workers comes in very early, so between the two of us the funeral home is rarely empty. We've both heard the same things: footsteps echoing down the long wood-floored hallways, faint voices in otherwise silent rooms, and quick movements just at the edge of our vision. These things are subtle, easy to dismiss, but we both know what we felt. And honestly, the funeral home itself is the calmest part of the property. The real weirdness lives in the cemetery. There was one morning when I was standing quietly at a graveside service, just before the family arrived. The ground was quiet, and the sky was starting to brighten. That's when I noticed a man standing under a tree not too far from me, about 30 yards out. He looked out of place. I scanned the road behind him and there were no cars. The only vehicles there belonged to the family and they hadn't even arrived yet. I turned to adjust something by the gravesite, and when I looked back, the man was gone. Completely vanished. There are 17 gardens on our property. It's wide open. I would have seen him walk away. There's nowhere here to hide. And I'm not the only one who's seen him. That same feeling, like someone is watching you from between the trees, comes up often in staff conversations, especially with the grounds crew. They're out there the most after all. One of my co-workers on the cemetery side had an especially strange connection with a widower. His wife had passed and he was commissioning a custom granite pedestal to hold her urn, a beautiful piece with a bird bath built on top. For nearly a year he called constantly asking if it had arrived yet. It hadn't, as custom granite takes time. When it finally came in, we placed his wife inside and held a private service. A few months later, that same co-worker woke up in the middle of the night heart pounding because she kept hearing a voice yelling directly into her ear, "Bird bath, bird bath, bird bath." The next morning she came into work looking pale. That voice had shaken her, and not long after she arrived we got the first call. The widower had passed away, and we hadn't even been notified yet. Now the last piece I want to tell you about is probably the most unsettling. We have one interior chapel mausoleum on site, just one. It's a beautiful structure with stained glass windows and rows of chairs for visitors and services. It locks every night at 4 p.m. and gets opened again at around 6 or 7 the next morning. One day the groundskeeper unlocked the mausoleum and went inside to flip on the lights. There was a woman sitting quietly in one of the chairs near the window facing away from him. He froze. There's only one door in and out, and he had just unlocked it. Panicking, she backed out and called the superintendent. But when they returned, she was gone. The place was empty. That mausoleum has a reputation, knocking sounds, shuffling, tools being mysteriously moved so often. In fact, I've made a habit of announcing myself every time I enter or leave just to show respect, or maybe to avoid waking anything up. When a maintenance crew came through for a few weeks, they started complaining almost immediately. Every morning they'd find their tools scattered across the chapel, moved from one side of the room to the other, over and over again. One of the workers flat out refused to return. I can't say I blame him. Whether you believe in spirits or just think energy lingers in the places we grieve, something is present here. And for those of us who spend our days and nights working among the dead, we learn to pay attention when something on the other side pays attention to us. I used to work at a funeral home and crematory. First on the admin side, which was mostly paperwork, scheduling, logistics, and later I moved on to the crematory itself. Oddly enough, the place didn't feel particularly haunted. No flickering lights or phantom footsteps. It was just a place that did feel quite sorrowful. But one case that I still remember does haunt me. She was a domestic violence victim, a woman who had finally left, who tried to start fresh. But of course, seeing as she ended up where she was, her ex found her and decided it would be best to shoot her multiple times in a parking lot. Most of those shots piercing her face. She had 3 sons, teenagers, the oldest barely 19. They came in to make arrangements. The youngers were 16 and 13, just boys. But we let them have a few minutes with her in a private room. We did what we could to cover the damage, just the basics, but it wasn't enough, and it never is really. I walked them down the hallway to the room where she was. Before they entered, I gave them the usual talk. She may not look the way you remember. Even in the best cases, death changes people. But we've done our best to preserve her dignity, to give you a memory you can carry. As the last words left my mouth, the temperature dropped. The room went cold. It was like all the warmth had been sucked out of it. And then the dizziness hit. It came fast, like someone had suddenly drained all the blood from my head. My knees went weak and I had to grab the side of a doorframe to stay upright. I've seen some pretty messed up things in my line of work. I've stood over charred and burnt bodies, decomposed remains, what's left of when someone takes their own life. This wasn't squeamishness. This was something else entirely. I felt like I was standing in something, or maybe someone standing in me. It's probably the best way to put it. But then came the strangest part. I had this sudden, powerful urge to speak, not from me, but through me. I wanted to turn to the boys and tell them, she's okay, she's not afraid anymore. Then, as clear as if someone whispered into my skull, I felt something directed at the middle child, the 16-year-old. Tell him I know. I forgive him. I didn't know what that meant, I didn't want to guess, but it hit me so hard I almost said it out loud. And I couldn't. I mean, I was on the job. I would have crossed a massive professional boundary. I'd have been fired on the spot. And beyond that, what if I was wrong? You see, I also have brain cancer, a tumor, and it affects my perception sometimes. So I always second-guess moments like this. I have to. My mind can play very realistic tricks on me. But this was like nothing I'd ever had before, or since. I chose not to say anything. I let the boys have their time. I stood outside shivering despite the heat being on full blast, gripping the doorframe like it was the only thing keeping me upright. I've had other strange experiences, but this was different. The cold, the message, the overwhelming need to speak someone else's words. Maybe it was just my mind playing games. Or maybe she was just trying to say goodbye. I've been working in the funeral business for a while now, and like most people who stick around, I've grown pretty numb to certain things that would make the average person throw up or pass out. I'd never thought I'd be the type to say this, but seeing dead people has become a weirdly normal part of my day. The worst case I ever dealt with was this elderly woman we had to pick up one summer. It was mid-July, hot as hell, and she'd been dead in her recliner for 4 days before someone finally found her. I remember her skin had this deep purple hue, like an overripe plum. We had to lift her from the recliner out onto our cot, and the moment we shifted her leg, something tore, and what came out was a lot of fluid. This putrid mix of blood and pus just streamed onto the carpet. It sounded exactly like someone peeing on the floor. The stench was... I honestly don't even have words. You never forget that smell. I wouldn't say I'm used to it, but I can recognize it immediately now. Anyway, that's the kind of thing I expected when I took this job. Death, decomposition, the occasional gruesome scene, it's part of the territory. What I didn't sign up for was the possibility that the funeral home itself might be, I don't know, haunted? Let me be clear, I haven't personally experienced anything, but a few of my co-workers swear weird stuff happens there. One of them, the guy who does the embalming, is convinced the place has spirits lingering around. My other two co-workers agree and think the building is straight up haunted. We've got security cameras installed in every room for obvious reasons. Each one is connected to a monitor in the back office that shows all the live feeds. What's interesting is that these cameras are motion sensitive, so a green light will flash on the monitor whenever someone is moving in one of the rooms. Well, one night at around 2 a.m., two of my co-workers had to respond to a removal call. They met up at the funeral home first before heading out. As they gathered their gear, one of them glanced at the monitor and saw the green motion lights blinking in multiple rooms. Not just one or two. It was as if someone or something was walking from room to room, setting off the sensors in sequence. But the place was locked, and there was no one inside. They checked the rooms but couldn't find anything. There was no malfunction with the cameras, just registering a movement that shouldn't have been possible. At first we laughed it off. Perhaps the system glitched. Maybe a mouse ran across the floor and triggered a sensor, though that doesn't explain the pattern of movement. But I can't lie. Every now and then when I'm in the building late at night, I find myself checking the corners of the room a little more than usual, just in case. Like I said, I'm used to seeing dead people now, but I don't think I'll ever get used to the idea that some of them might still be hanging around. I'm a funeral director, and due to my profession, I come across the dead and anything related more often than your average Joe. In the past 8 years that I've been working as a funeral director in Germany, me and my colleagues have experienced numerous unexplainable things that stuck with us. One of them I'd like to share. The story begins at the end of a pickup in the middle of the night at 2 a.m. We had just finished rolling the casket into the cooling unit and were sitting by the desk around the corner filling in our nighttime sheets. You need to know that our hygienic area and makeshift office are separated by our catch of caskets waiting to be put to use. The light in there is always off, so all the lighting you get is the faint shimmer of cold white light coming from the hygienic area. I looked to my left as I finished writing my timesheet and was startled to see a dark figure standing right by the walkway between the casket illuminated from the back of the mentioned light. I slowly poked my colleague to look, and he also saw the figure after a few seconds of blank staring, and I called out to them thinking it was one of our colleagues, but they didn't answer. So we called out again. Since we had had intruders before at the funeral home, both of us got up and slowly walked towards the figure, calling out to it. About halfway towards the figure, it suddenly turned and audibly walked out of sight towards the cooling unit. My colleague and I quickly followed, but as we rounded the corner, nothing was there. The big black door was still locked, and the only window was barred up and cluttered with stuff anyway. Out of fear of an actual intruder, we searched around everywhere, but eventually gave up. Both of us were sure we saw a ghost that night. It was too clear to just be some strange shadow, and we heard it. We're still looking for an explanation. The following story took place in approximately 1990, in a Southern California medical school morgue. I will relate things in detail as I can clearly still remember them, almost as if it were yesterday. The entrance to the main morgue office and lab is housed behind a solid, secure pair of double doors. These doors are often left open during work hours, but if no one is in the office, they are secured. As soon as you step through the threshold in front of you, about a yard away is a big blue shower curtain that conceals the room behind it. To the right is the office area. That is somewhat cramped, with 3 large desks and 1 huge filing cabinet. The extremely basic file of each case, their ID number and death certificate, are initially kept in the file drawers until after the case has been used or move on to the next location. To the left is a large storage area that houses large freezers for bodies, as well as numerous shelves with specimens and supplies. As cliché as it may sound, the day of my sighting started out like any other day. I was the only one working on 3 separate cases that were all situated on their respective gurneys and in their own level of the embalming process. I had been working on the case for approximately 3 hours without interruption from any of my co-workers. I think it's safe to say that I was very absorbed in my work on that particular day. It was getting close to lunch, so I decided to wash up and head to the office to take my lunch. As I passed by the door to the room that held the 3 large vertical refrigerators and the row upon row of already embalmed bodies, I looked to my right and clearly saw a full-sized apparition. I froze in my footsteps like a character in a cartoon and looked to my right further to see an older man standing in front of the closest vertical refrigerator. It was simply standing there. I could see through him, but at the same time clearly identify it as a person. As I stood there and looked for what seemed like minutes, it was probably only seconds, the apparition turned to look at me and simply faded away and disappeared, almost like cigarette smoke dissipates into the environment. I continued to look in that direction, dumbfounded. It was not scary in the least, but almost comforting, as if it was a completely natural and everyday occurrence. I merely went into the office and saw my co-worker William and exclaimed, "You won't believe what I just saw." He was completely unfazed and looked at me and he said, "You saw a ghost." I was more taken aback by him knowing what I saw than what I had truly seen. He went on to tell me that he had seen them quite often and enjoys the interaction when it happens. When we told our co-worker Joe what happened, they were completely taken aback, scared and frantic. I tried to explain the visit as more of a comforting interaction than one of a traditional Hollywood haunting. That offered little comfort, and the rest of the day was rather off-kilter. One of the other employees that worked for the morgue office under paperwork capacity exclusively was Lola. She worked way down the hall away from the actual work facilities and was basically responsible for processing every piece of paperwork that needed to be dealt with throughout our office. She was a petite, insightful lady who believed strongly in spirited events that involved interactions with the deceased. She would often attend seance-like events with friends and had reported successful contacts. She had planned to attend one of her spiritual meetings the following day and said she would bring it up with the group in attendance. We all kind of thought that it was neat, but really shrugged it off and didn't think of her involvement in the situation further than that. That was until 3 days later, when she came to speak with us about what she had come across. Apparently her group leader during their seance reached out inquiring to the desire of the apparition that appeared before me. The group leader received the sense that the apparition was just somewhat confused and didn't quite know where to go. This theme continued during the meeting with the sons of the apparition, that it was just uncomfortable and lacking direction. The other extremely noteworthy feeling was the group leader came across was the letter W constantly appearing before her. It was as if the whole meeting and interaction with the apparition revolved around the level of confusion and the letter W. Everyone's curiosity was spiked by what Lola had to say, me especially. We all then walked over to where I saw the apparition, and I explained to everybody what I saw and where I saw it. And that's when things got a little eerie. I don't recall who noticed it, but in one of the refrigerators directly in front of where I saw the apparition was a name tag, William Wood. There's no doubt in my mind as to what I saw that day. And reflecting back upon it, I believe my conscious level of thinking was down while my subconscious level was up. Having been so involved in working on cases all morning, somehow this allowed my subconscious or inner spirit to perhaps see something I would not normally see. a heightened sense of relaxation, or openness to speak perhaps. My grandmother was a Cajun voodoo black witch. Dark stuff. This included, but was not limited to, animal sacrifices, bloodletting, and the like. We were all convinced she had a place waiting for her in hell. She was not a big woman, she was maybe 5 foot tall, 100 pounds, and at her funeral they had 4 men carry her casket from the funeral home to the hearse. At the church, it took 6 to get her out. It took 8 to get her into the cemetery, and she got heavier and heavier as they got closer to the grave. 10 men it took to get her into the actual grave. When we returned to the house, where the rest of the family was, me and my uncle went to the kitchen, and the kitchen was hot. It was like opening an oven door hot, and this was mid-February at the time, in a house in the country with no electricity. Inside the kitchen, we both saw a sight that chilled us to our bone. Grandma, whom we'd just buried, holding hands with 4 other women. I didn't know them all, but my uncle knew a couple. One was his grandma's sister, who had died some years ago, and the other was grandma's mum, who was long dead. But we didn't know the other 2. Seeing that, understandably, scared the ever-loving bejesus out of us. We left, and have not been back to that house since, and that was close to 30 years ago. I wonder if that heat we felt was from hell itself. I used to be a funeral director in my hometown. One night, my colleague and I had just gotten back to the funeral home after a call to retrieve the body of a 24-year-old man who had died suddenly in a motorcycle accident. We were moving him from the removal cot to the embalming table when we both froze. There was a distinct click from across the room. The old tabletop radio, the ones with manual volume knobs that click when you turn them on, suddenly came to life at full volume. But it wasn't static this time. It was playing Wish You Were Here by Pink Floyd loud and clear. We looked at each other completely stunned. My colleague, who was pretty devout and usually composed, went pale and excused himself. I turned the radio off. I usually played music from my phone while working, and I didn't even think that radio still worked. But when I was done with the embalming and started moving the body to the dressing table, I heard it click again. Same radio, same song, still at full volume, like someone had turned it on intentionally. At that point, I decided I'd had enough. I shut everything down and left for the night. My colleague and I never spoke about what happened, and as far as I know, nothing like that ever happened again. But he did quit the following month. This is when I worked as a mortuary transport technician. The job was basically transporting the deceased from where they were to where they needed to go. Turns out dead people can have a lot of appointments. One time though, I had an experience I will never forget. I was dropping off someone at a science donation place. This is where you donate your body to science, and they take it from there. So I wheeled in the deceased, unlocked the freezer, and did all my stuff I had to do there. I placed him on the board, got the lift out, and placed him on the shelf. The interesting thing about the freezer was that most everything, once it's processed, was wrapped in this blue tape type thing, and you could definitely tell it was inside. Legs, hands, feet. Kind of interesting to me at the time. I shut the freezer, lock it back up, and start wheeling the gurney back over to the garage door. The science drop-off and processing area was a big L shape with the freezer off to the larger, longer portion, and when you turn the corner, there are desks and filing cabinets and whatnot. I almost had a heart attack, as when I turned the corner there's just this guy standing there examining files in the filing cabinet. Looked just like you or me, dressed modernly but a bit out of place for what people usually wear there. I stopped and said that he'd have to forgive me, but he almost gave me a heart attack. It didn't look like he heard me at all, or even knew I was there. I should mention this was about 1 a.m, and I'd never seen anyone at this place so late. So I said, "Well, sorry if I startled you or anything. and went on about finishing my stuff. I got the gurney back in the van, closed it, and locked the large garage door from the inside. All the while this guy's just standing there, staring at an open file in front of him, not paying any attention to me. I had to use the bathroom, so I told him that's where I'd be going and that I'd be right back. Again, no response. I thought maybe he was deaf or couldn't hear me, so I went to the bathroom, came back to the garage, and the guy is gone, but the filing cabinet was still open. I didn't know where he went, and I hadn't heard anyone walk down the hallway past the bathroom. I checked, and made sure everything I was responsible for was still locked, and it was. So I just announced I was going to be leaving and locking up and set the alarm. No response. And that's what I did, and left. I'm not sure who he was, or what happened, but it definitely was an odd experience, and one I still remember perfectly. It kind of freaks me out though. Was he a figment of my imagination? I don't think so. A phantom? Or someone who could move as stealthily as a ninja? Who knows the truth? I work at a cemetery in Norway. It's not the kind of job most people imagine doing, but it's not one I talk about often. But I need to get something off my chest. Here in Norway we have a law. A grave is protected for 20 years. After that, if no one pays to renew the plot, it can legally be reopened and reused. I know it sounds harsh, but it's how we manage space. Usually after 2 decades underground, there's not much left. Bone fragment, skeleton. Enough to respectfully shift aside before laying someone else to rest. So a few years ago, I was assisting with a burial at what should have been clean, a reused site. The record said the previous occupant had been interred in the early 1960s, so more than 50 years ago. I expected soil, maybe some bones, nothing more. But boy was I wrong. The moment we broke through the last few feet of earth, the stench hit. Hot, wet, chemical sweet. It wasn't like death. It was worse. Like meat left in a sealed bag under the sun for months. Something thick and rancid, bubbling up from the hole like a huge red flag. That's when we saw it. The glint of plastic under the soil. I'll never forget the sound it made. A wet hiss, followed by a sickening slosh, and then the pressure released. The fluid spilled out, dark, viscous and foul, splattering the surrounding dirt. The body inside wasn't skeletal. It was intact, swollen and mummified in soup. The face was still there, bloated beyond recognition. The skin stretched and sloughing from the bone in sheets. Hair floated in the slurry, nails clouded, jelly-like eyes still pressed into their sockets. We all recoiled, one of the newer workers puking into the grass. I nearly did myself. What was meant to be a simple grave opening turned into a biohazard nightmare. No one had prepared us for this. The deceased hadn't decomposed. She'd fermented. 50 years of slow and putrid digestion inside a man-made sarcophagus. That day changed how I looked at death. I don't know who thought plastic would be a good idea though. Back then, funeral homes started wrapping the deceased in sheets of thick polyethylene. The reasoning was dignity, preventing smells, leakages, preserving clothing and features. Maybe it felt respectful, maybe it just felt convenient. But what the plastic really did was trap them, seal them in, slow the natural decay to a crawl, and create a kind of grotesque time capsule filled with trapped moisture, liquefied flesh, and bloated gas. Years ago, I picked up a temp job working for a landscaping company. Most of it was basic stuff, mowing lawns, trimming hedges, that kind of stuff. But one of their contracts was maintaining a local graveyard. which meant we also dug graves. I didn't think much of it at first, just another job. But there are parts of that still linger in my mind even now. So one rainy afternoon I was assigned to help dig a fresh grave. The way it works is you slot together these big metal panels to form a rectangle, kind of like building a box in the mud. Then, you nest slightly smaller panels inside that first shape, going deeper each time, so you end up with reinforced walls all the way down. At the bottom, you shape the dirt into a small mound, where the head and foot of the coffin will rest to help with lowering the rope and removal. The funeral came and went. The family left. I had to jump on the grave to start pulling out the panels, working my way from the bottom up. But when the coffin's in there's almost no room left. The only real place to put your foot is the coffin itself. And remember, it was still raining. I slipped. My foot crashed right through the top of the casket, straight into it. I felt something soft give way, and I was standing on someone, a dead person. When I yanked my boot out, I saw the shredded remains of the suit they'd dressed the body in. I froze, trying not to look, trying not to think about it. In the end, the weight of the dirt would have crushed the coffin anyway, so no real harm done. At least that's what I told myself. But that feeling, that wrongness of being inside someone's coffin with them, even for a second, it's icky and it sticks with you, and that isn't even the worst part. Have you ever heard of graves being rented? Turns out if the family doesn't keep up the payments after a decade or so, the body gets exhumed and moved to a boneyard. We've had to do that sometimes too. But some genius had decided, probably to save money, to start burying people in thick, industrial plastic bags instead of proper caskets. So when we went to dig them up, our shovels would go straight through those bags. And inside, it wasn't bone dry. It was a half-liquefied mess, a soup of mud, rot, and hair, fabric, bones. One guy said it smelled like wet dog food and sewage. You'd hit one of those bags and the contents would shift like it was still alive. It never bothered me emotionally, not even the coffin thing, not even the soup bags. It was just people. People die, you do what needs doing. But there was one time. They handed me this small coffin, smaller than anything I'd ever seen before, barely the length of my arm. It didn't weigh much. I lowered it to the grave like I'd done 100 times before. But something about the size made it feel wrong, like the earth wasn't supposed to open for something that small. When I started shoveling the sand back in, the sound it made, soft, almost apologetic, started messing with my head. I kept going layer by layer, watching it disappear beneath the soil. It felt like I was burying something that hadn't even had the chance to belong here yet. And when it was done, I just stood there for a long minute, not because I was tired, just unsettled. The grave looked too big now, like it would swallow more than what I'd put in. I've stood on corpses, torn open plastic graves bags full of rot and black sludge, but that one hit different, I'm telling you. I've been in funeral services for about 6 years now. I got into it for a stable job, not because of some deep calling, but after what happened last summer, I don't look at death the same way. Most days are uneventful, sad, yes, but routine. The worst, obviously, are infant deaths. I don't even have words for those. We've had a few dog mauling cases, infants whose faces had to be reconstructed using mortuary putty glue and cosmetics. And then there are the decomp cases. Those stay with you. We picked up a woman who died in her bathtub and wasn't found for 3 weeks. By the time we got there, her fluids had drained down the tub like she was melting. Skin slip is bad enough. But when we grabbed her under the arms to transfer her to the cot, whole sheets of flesh just came off in our gloves. Her scalp partially detached. It felt like lifting wet paper, and the smell was something repugnant. But even with all that, the worst thing bodies do, the one thing that gets to me, is purging. When a body expels fluid from the nose or mouth and even the eyes, that rancid, bile-sweet stench hits you before you even uncover the body. Sometimes it trickles out, sometimes it spurts. And the eyes, God. Sometimes they're sunken in and black, sometimes they liquefy and bulge, and there's that look, that slack-jaw, wide-eyed expression like they died mid-sentence. I've had more than a few nightmares about those faces. The other text warned me about the death moan. See, when you move a decomposing body, the air built up can escape, and if it passes through the throat and vocal cords, it can sound like a moan. The first time it happened to me, I dropped my tools and almost bolted. One guy quit after a body sighed in his face. Still, nothing really got to me until last summer. We picked up this man who had died alone in his home. Massive guy, at least 400 pounds. He'd been down for days, and the heat hadn't been kind. His face was bloated, skin splitting in places, fluids all around the recliner he'd perished in. That night I had the morning cremation shift. Big bodies have to go in early to keep the retort from overheating. I wheeled him in just before sunrise. It was quiet, and the whole place was still in that dead silence before anyone showed up. As I was finishing transferring him to the tray, I heard something, a soft crack like cartilage shifting. That's normal, happens all the time when you move the limbs or adjust the body, but this wasn't that. It sounded like it came from the head. I leaned in to check the position of the jaw, and I swear to God, it looked slightly more shut than it had been earlier. I chalked it up to settling. Sometimes rigor sets in a bit and gravity does its thing, but it was enough to make me pause. Then I noticed something else. On the inside of the crematory door, where it had fogged up from the change in temperature, there was a single streak, like someone had traced a line through it. And I stood there for a good 10 seconds at least, staring. I didn't hear a voice, but something felt off. I felt like I wasn't alone in that room. I went ahead with the process, closed the door and started the cycle, did everything by the book. But I couldn't stop glancing back at the glass on the door. That streak stayed until the heat wiped the fog away. I didn't tell anyone about that, not because I'm scared they won't believe me. Hell, I barely believe it myself. But because whatever it was, it didn't feel like a ghost or a spirit. It felt like the last bit of a person that didn't want to go. Just reluctance. Now every time I'm alone during a cremation, I check the glass before I start. Just in case. So far there's been nothing. But I keep looking. Working at a funeral home comes with its unusual experiences. It's a tough job, especially when it involves preparing children. It's heartbreaking every single time. On the other hand, you get used to handling unexpected challenges, like when larger people don't fit into standard caskets and adjustments need to be made. What did get to me were the strange things that happened late at night. A lot of families we served were from Malaysia, and they had this tradition of bringing food as offerings. The food wasn't really the weird part though. What I saw while working those late nights definitely was. Now, funeral homes are naturally eerie places, dim lighting, the quiet hum of refrigeration units, and the air itself sometimes felt heavier than it should. But the strangest things happened when the building was practically empty late at night. Because sometimes when I was closing up, I'd hear faint whispers. I'd chalk it up to exhaustion, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me, but it always felt off. There was one time during a service, when it went on later than usual, I was tidying up one of the rooms when I noticed an odd sensation, like someone was standing right behind me. I turned around expecting to see a co-worker, but there was no one there. The room was completely empty. I decided to snap a quick photo of the room before closing it off, just as a habit. It wasn't until the next day when I looked at the photo more closely that I realized something was off. In the background, where the casket was placed, there was a face. Not just any face. It was clear with distinct features, hollow eyes, a narrow nose, and a slightly open mouth, as if it were talking and caught mid-sentence. There were no mirrors, no reflective surfaces that could have caused it, just the casket and the face. But that's not the only strange thing I caught on camera. Another time I was taking a photo of the hallway in broad daylight, just documenting the space for our records, and in the photo you can clearly see someone standing at the end of the hall. It looks like a person in a skirt, almost like a woman. But here's the thing. There was no one else around at that time. I was completely alone, and no one working that day had worn anything remotely similar to what this figure was wearing. I showed both of these photos to a few friends and co-workers, and everyone agreed. It wasn't a trick of the light or a smudge. Something or someone was captured in those images. I still have them, but I'm careful who I show them to. I felt like I captured something that wasn't meant for human eyes. Since then, I've heard more stories from people who worked at the funeral home, all talking about similar experiences, but nothing quite as chilling as what I captured in those pictures. I've been in the funeral business for a while now, to say the least, and I've seen my fair share of weird stuff, but this one stuck with me in ways I don't think I'll ever be able to shake. The family of the deceased was loaded, like generational money rich, and they had a very specific set of instructions for the service. First thing that threw us off, they wanted him buried in a custom-tailored black suit. Not weird, until we noticed the inner lining of the lapel had a patch of human flesh sewn into it, like an actual rotting piece of skin. Turns out it was a section of his mother's back that had been preserved poorly, I might add, and stitched close to his heart at the family's request. The smell was unholy. I've been around decomposition long enough to be pretty numb, but this was something else. My eyes watered, my head pounded, the entire prep room reeked for a day after that. Then there was the music. For the processional, the aunt handed us a handwritten score, supposedly composed by the deceased himself. It was actually not bad, except there was an instruction in the notes to include a solo using a Stongsel fluzel. We had no idea what that was, and when we asked the aunt, she just shrugged and said, maybe he made it up. He was always writing about weird instruments that didn't exist. We ended up substituting in a flute, and it worked fine, but the whole piece had this unsettling, dissonant vibe, like something out of a horror movie soundtrack, but slower. Oh, and there's the part I really wish I were making up. They requested we stuff the groin of the body, their words, not mine. The goal was apparently to give him a proud and commanding silhouette, specifically down there. We tried, we really did. But what they were asking for wasn't physically possible, like trying to jam a pillow into a bottle of wine. I don't know if the guy was some eccentric artist or just completely gone in the head, but that funeral felt less like a farewell and more of a surreal, posthumous performance art. Anyway, money talks, we did the best we could, but that stench, the music and that patch of skin, I still remember it vividly and wish I hadn't. People think being a funeral home director is a depressing profession. And in some ways it is, but it's important and that's why I do it. This one place I was working at when I was 27 was a 2-story building built in the 1940s. Flat roof, square brick face, nothing fancy. The ground floor had a chapel off to the left with a green carpet, wooden pews, tall windows that barely let any sun in. And across the hall we had 2 visitation rooms, a break room, and a short flight of steps leading to my office, tucked away in the back. Downstairs in the basement where the prep room and refrigeration units and the crematory were, was where the real silence lived. Concrete walls, sharp-smelling chemicals, and everything made of stainless steel. That's where I spent most of my days. Over nearly 3 decades, I've done thousands of removals, embalmings, viewings, services, and cremations. I've worked with grieving families, processed death certificates, handled infants, elders, accident victims, people who take their own lives, you name it, I've probably done it. But there are 3 stories that I don't think I'll ever shake. 3 events which touched me in different ways. And I'm about to share them all with you. This first one happened about 10 years ago, and it was raining extremely heavily that week. I'll never forget it. We were holding services for a man in his late 80s. Nothing unusual, closed casket, and a straightforward visitation and burial. His family had already come and gone earlier in the day, and I was locking up for the night. I always did a sweep, turned off lights, checked casket lids, and made sure no one had wandered in or out. As I stepped into the chapel to shut down, I saw someone sitting in the second pew, just sitting there facing forwards. I stopped in the doorway. My immediate reaction was to apologize, thinking maybe it was a family member that had come back through a side entrance. But the moment I looked at him, I got goosebumps. I could feel them all the way up my spine and across my arms. Something didn't feel right. It was a woman in her 30s, wet hair hanging around her shoulders and pale skin, wearing a dress that looked soaked clean through. Her hands were folded in her lap. She didn't look at me. Ma'am, we're closing for the night. Can I help you?" She didn't even move. When I stepped forward, she turned her head slightly, and that's when I saw her face. There was something wrong with her mouth. It hung open, stretched unnaturally wide, and her eyes were grey, milky, like death. Trust me, I would know. I blinked, and she was gone. I looked around. There was nowhere for her to have gone. I looked to the pew itself, to the carpet, but there were no traces of any water being tracked in from anywhere. That whole thing didn't sit well with me and really creeped me out. A few months down the line, when I was talking to a coworker and going through some old files in order to move them around, one of them noticed a name, and it turned out to be the name of the very gentleman we had been referring to. Tragic case, that one. Oh really? How so? He was quite old. Oh no, not him. The daughter. She died when she was around 32. She drowned. I was taken aback. You see, I'd never told anyone what I saw about that woman in the chapel. I asked him for more details. Yeah, she was out by the lake with some friends, but no one really knows what happened and she drowned. Such a shame, really. I think that must have been one of the things that led to the decline in his health. I can't say for sure, but I know what I saw, and it creeped me out profoundly. The next story comes with heartbreak. She was 14. Nothing really wrong with her. One afternoon while she was at school, she slipped in the bathroom. Someone had stuffed the sinks with wet paper towels to make them overflow. Some other girls thinking it would be funny to make a girl slip. And slip she did. But she then cracked her head on the tiled floor. When they found her, the school went into lockdown. When she arrived at the funeral home, she was still wearing her school uniform. They hadn't removed it at the morgue. A faded blue polo shirt with a little school crest, navy slacks, shoes scuffed from walking in the hallway. They were dry at least. I was the one who prepped her. It wasn't the physical process that got to me. I'd handled children before. But what broke me was knowing that some kids thought they'd be funny, play a little prank, and that in doing so, they had taken a child's life, one of their own. And I don't think I'll ever forget that. At her funeral, I stood beside her casket as her classmates filed in, and there was this one specific girl who was just crying inconsolably and muttering, "I'm sorry." I don't know if she was the one who stuffed the sink with wet paper towels and left it on or not, but it certainly sounds like it. Her locker at school stayed decorated for months, and her mother still sends Christmas cards to our office. This last one is depressing for different ways. There was one man we kept in refrigeration for 9 months. 9. That's not even supposed to happen. Body are usually processed, claimed, or buried within a week or 2 at most. Even in cases with family complications, legal delays, or religious disputes, a month pushing it. But this man, he had no one. No family, no emergency contact, no friends listed, no medical proxy, nothing. He died in a government-subsidized apartment on the edge of town. He'd been dead for nearly 2 weeks before anyone even knocked on his door. Only because he'd missed work. When he arrived at the funeral home, he was labeled as a municipal hold unclaimed, and we put him in refrigeration and waited for the city to sort it out. I remember he was wearing a t-shirt with faded print that said, "Gotta catch 'em all" across his chest, and no socks. We waited. A week, then a month. Every so often I'd open his cooler and do a visual check and find myself whispering, "Still here, huh?" 6 months in, his skin started to dry and tighten, so he was technically preserved via temperature, but the human body isn't meant to be suspended indefinitely. His face shrank inwards, lip retracted, eyes collapsed. His hands curled like they were folding inwards on themselves. 9 months passed, and finally the city signed off on a direct cremation. No service, no ashes claimed, just a line on a spreadsheet and a slot in the incinerator. I pulled him out that morning, rolled the cart down to the crematory myself. I usually don't speak during cremations, but that day I did. I said, "I'm sorry we forgot you." The flame took 23 minutes to reach full burn, and when it was over I looked inside his chamber. His skull had split clean down the center, perfectly symmetrical, and I've never seen that happen before or since. We placed the remains in a plastic urn and set him on the shelf in the storage closet with the others. The unclaimed. He's still there, as are 12 others. Sometimes I wonder if the soul sticks around until someone remembers them. I wonder if there's something worse than death, like being erased in lots of tiny pieces. People ask me why I left the industry, and I tell them it wasn't burnout, it wasn't grief or the bodies. It was the doors. The ones I opened and never fully closed. The chapel pew, the forgotten, the people who died, who were taken by stupidity and malice. I still carry those people with me, and I can't ever forget them. Because when you work in this profession, you get numb to a lot of things, but there are some cases that hit you so hard that they just refuse to be forgotten. And maybe that's right. But that's why I left, and I'm glad to be doing something else now. This job definitely isn't for the faint of heart. 50 years ago, when I was in high school and college, I taught CPR and first aid classes for the Red Cross in a building that was built in the mid-1800s. Most of the time, the classes were between 10 to 15 people and ended around 10 at night. After class, I'd watch everyone leave, lock up, then clean up. Classes were on the second floor, and I'd have to carry the CPR dummies down to the basement for storage. Creaky stairs, bad lighting, and the shelves were stacked with CPR dummies that looked like corpses. That basement was creepy as hell. It always felt like you were being watched. I'd hear footsteps following me up the stairs and constantly checked over my shoulder. While I was in the basement, I almost always heard footsteps upstairs. The first time or two I rushed upstairs to see who I'd forgotten and looked inside, but there never was anyone but me in the building. The office staff in the building left at 5, so I almost never saw them. But I decided to get there early to see if the office ladies knew anything about the creepy basement and footsteps. They all laughed at me. They all knew it was haunted. They had names for the ghosts. There was a little girl they'd seen and heard singing. There were muffled voices, footsteps, and the toilets flushed on their own. But none of them would go in the basement. Never the basement. Apparently the Red Cross had bought the building from a former funeral home. The basement was where they did the embalming. I eventually got used to it, but the first few times, at the age of 17, that place scared the crap out of me. When I was young, I used to be one of the world's biggest chickens. I come from Arizona, and spooky lore is something that comes with the territory. When I was around 11, we moved to Kern County. The house we lived in was used by a mortuary for wakes and to keep bodies prior to burying. When we first moved in, the place really creeped me out. It made a lot of noise, unusual for a home that wasn't that old. I was a big reader of Fate magazine when I was young, and that was fuel for the fire to my overactive imagination. But I never saw anything in that house. I only heard noises, like people walking across the hardwood floors. There were nights when I couldn't sleep. To make matters worse, my mum would always hold seances with all of my older sister's friends, and everyone would get the hell scared out of them. One night there was a carnival in town. I went there with my friend Pete. My sister went with her friends, and my mum had taken my younger sister, who was still in a stroller. Pete and I left to go home. Pete walked me to the house, we said our goodbyes, and he left. I would never go directly into the house. I knew where the light switch was, and I would reach in with my arm and turn on the living and dining room lights before entering the house. Those 2 rooms checked out okay, so I went into the kitchen and then down the hallway to my mum's room. Mum wasn't in her room, so I went to my sister Kathy's room. I could see from the hall light that she was in bed and under the covers. She was breathing really heavily, like in a really deep sleep. I didn't want to turn on her lights and wake her, so I tiptoed in and checked the locks on her window. They were locked, and so I made my way to my room. As usual, I took off my clothes and jumped into bed. I didn't turn on my room light since I had the hall light and front room lights on. I felt safe since Kathy was home and started falling asleep. As I was almost asleep, I heard my mum come in with my younger sister. She went directly into the kitchen and I could hear her getting my sister's bottles ready. She walked into my room and asked if Kathy was home, and I said yes. So she went back to the kitchen. I have to point out that if you've even farted in this house, the floors would creak, so no one could get up and walk around without being heard. I was just dozing off when my mum came in, and man was she pissed. She asked me, "Where the hell is Kathy at?" I told her she was in bed, and Mum got even angrier. "Kathy isn't in bed. Are you lying for Kathy so she can stay out late?" I said, "Mum, Kathy's in bed. When I came home, I went to her room and she was asleep under the covers and had the covers pulled over her head. I could hear her breathing heavily." Mum got more angry. "Show me." I walked into my sister's room. My mum had the light on already, and I looked at the bed and it was untouched, like no one had even sat on it. I ran over to the window to check the locks and they were locked. Mum said, "Well, where is she?" I pointed at the bed horrified and said, "You guys are playing a joke on me, right?" To which my mum replied, "I'll show you a joke." And that went directly to my ass. During this period, Kathy got home and read the Riot Act. But I stopped my mum and told her, and Kathy, "Look, there was something sleeping under her bed. That's why I thought it was her. And that's why I told you it was her. I could see the bedding moving up and down from the breathing. There was something in that bed and it wasn't her since she just walked in. And I don't want to sleep here tonight." Ghost or not, I had to stay in my room. Kathy opted for the couch and my mum still wasn't buying our story. But whatever was in that room, in that bed, was breathing. It had a human body shape, and it took about 5 years off my life. I'm glad when we left, and I never want to return. Sharing a house with a morgue is creepy as hell. I managed a memorial park, cemetery, and funeral home between 2007 and 11, handling operations, sales, and customer service. The funny thing is that I never experienced anything paranormal while working on site, and I worked many times until late in the evening, being the only person there beside the security guards. The memorial park was developed in 2002 over land that had been farmland. It was then consecrated using ceremonies of various faiths which were prerequisites to be able to hold services there. It had 3 chapels for services and wakes, and of course a space for the mortician to conduct his work. Headstones were not allowed as a policy, only plaques. So all you could see were beautiful gardens and landscapes. All burials were underground except for an area reserved for family mausoleums. Around 500 people were interred there when I started working, and we had services about every day or so. Some people mentioned eerie feelings or hearing noises, but nothing of note. The energy, for lack of a better word, was heavy, which is understandable for a place with so much sorrow. But the weirdest thing we had to deal with was what happened late one night when a driver went to the local hospital after bringing over a deceased person, and the person woke up during the ride to the park. Understandably, the driver took the week off. Thus my confusion when I've gone through some very strange paranormal episodes, yet was not sensitive or as sensitive as some people suggested to be able to see anything during my tenure there. But nonetheless, I feel for that poor guy. He must have had a heart attack nearly. I'm a mortician and manager of a cemetery. I worked in this field for over 30 years. The unexplained, things that go bump in the night, do not frighten me at all. But for me, this was different. As part of my employment, I had to stay in company-provided family housing located at the rear of the cemetery for ground security around the clock. Over the years, I've had experiences as a mortician that I deem paranormal, but this is one that both my daughter, age 16, and I both experienced. During one summer when we had our windows open at night, I would hear a deep, fairly loud, heavy breathing outside, like right outside the window. I looked outside several times, but nothing was there. We live in the North Woods, so I'd write it off as maybe a moose or other large animal, as we do have moose in the area, but would never see them in the summer, just wintertime. I'd just ignore it, thinking I'd imagined it. This took place over the course of about a month. About 10 years later, I mentioned this experience to my daughter. She told me she would hear the same thing late at night and would just pull her blankets over her head. This was not a faint sound, but very noticeable. Being a mortician and living in a cemetery for 25 years, there were strange things the family would experience from time to time, but this was a repeated event that we both experienced. I'm just wondering if it's oral, unexplained, sounds like this are unique, or if others have heard stuff like that late at night too. I'd love to get other people's take on this, as it's left me baffled for the longest time. I was once dating a guy twice my age who I worked with at a grocery store. He had a side hustle with a morgue where he picked up bodies on call. He takes them to the morgue and does paperwork, tags them and puts them in a freezer. I thought what he did was admirable, because someone needs to do it, and death is a touchy subject. He made himself out to be this really great person who cares about people, and dead people, and wants to be the guy who can help get the hard stuff done in a caring manner. Unfortunately, he turned out to be a creep. The morgue also does funeral services and stuff, so there are little rooms with chairs and such, and an office. One night we were supposed to be hanging out, and he asked me to meet him at the morgue. This was in the middle of the night. No one else was there, and I figured we'd meet up and leave to get food or just talk in his car like usual, but instead, he wanted me to go inside. He showed me around the little rooms and the offices. It was kind of cool, almost like being in a horror video game. Then he told me to wait, and he left me in the office. After a few minutes, he messaged me and told me to come into a room I hadn't been in. It was the room where they get the bodies ready for the freezer and do the paperwork. I didn't know. I went inside, and there was a dead body just out in the open in the middle of the room on a gurney. I froze in the doorway because I wasn't expecting it. I felt like I should have been upset, but he thought it was funny and kind of just played it cool. He wanted me to look at it. It was an old lady. I've seen plenty of stuff like this on the internet, so I didn't think it was particularly messed up. He finished up and then took me into the freezer to show me the other bodies. There were about 6 in body bags, only one other one unzipped. He then showed me the oven where they were cremated. This was all in the middle of the night, with no warning on my part, and there was no one else in the building. I kind of just blocked out the memory for a few months. I started having issues, other ones with the guy, and ended up telling the story to a friend. And he helped me realize that the situation was kind of messed up, and I thought I'd share it with all of you. I don't know what you think, but being tricked to see dead bodies isn't really my idea of a fun date, and it kind of creeped me out. I guess it all comes down to how you deal with death, and it's quite personal in the end. I ended up blocking this guy and everything. Hope he leaves me alone. Hey guys, it's Mort here. So what did you think of that story? Did you listen to the story? Did you gag like I did? No, I'm not even joking. I gagged twice. It was foul. I was just like, the description was too much for me. Ugh. I did manage to get through it. Jeez. Some things. And I've read stuff like that before, but it really hit me today. Not sure why. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed. I certainly did. I'll be back tomorrow with some... what is it? Alone at Night stories. Yeah, those are going to be pretty good. So please tune in to finish off, so that we can finish off this huge June content bonanza together. Huge thanks as always to the members and patrons who support me financially with a tiny amount every month and get some cool perks. Like today's cool perk is apparently medium stories, exclusive stuff. So if you are one, check it out. You can watch it now if you want. But that's it from me for tonight. Stay awesome. Thank you for watching. Hopefully see you tomorrow, and good night.